Welcome to the 2024 DiLCo lecture series on digital language and communication. I'm Yanis Androtsopoulos from the University of Hamburg. DiLCo is a 3-year scientific network on digital language variation in context, initiated in 2021. It is coordinated here in Hamburg by my colleague Heike Zinsmeister and myself, and includes scholars from universities in the US, UK, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Denmark. DiLCo is generously supported by the University of Hamburg within the Universities of Excellence scheme funded by the German federal government and the federal states. The DiLCo network aims to stimulate scientific exchange between various approaches to digital language and communication research within linguistics, and to bridge gaps between interactional and computational research methods. To this purpose, we organize online and on-site activities such as conference panels, methods workshops, and this lecture series. Our lectures showcase cutting-edge international research by senior and younger scholars who draw on key concepts in sociocultural linguistics to shed light on language use in digital communication. These lectures are recorded and made available in an open access repository currently located on Hamburg University's video portal, Lecture2Go, and accessible through the DiLCo website. Each of the lectures is about 40 to 45 minutes, followed by discussion. Feel free to post any questions and comments into the chat during or after the lecture. Right, I'm happy to introduce our speaker for today, Christoph Purschke, who is a member of the DiLCo network, like all speakers in this last round of lectures in 2024. Christoph is Associate Professor in Computational Linguistics at the University of Luxembourg. He is also Director and Founder of the Culture and Computation Lab in the Department of Humanities there in Luxembourg. Christoph received his training in German linguistics at the University of Marburg in Germany, with a particular focus on empirical dialectology. His doctoral dissertation, submitted in, I think, 2010, was an empirical study in the field of perceptual variation linguistics, focusing on listener judgments of regional or on-regional language varieties. After this, Christoph remained affiliated to the research center Deutscher Sprachatlas in Marburg before moving on to other posts in Germany and Austria, and eventually to Luxembourg. Even though Christoph has maintained his connections to German dialectology and variationist sociolinguistics, he eventually developed a focus on computational sociolinguistics, involving, among other things, the development of apps for the elicitation and analysis of Luxembourgish, and the study of a huge corpus of user comments to Luxembourg media, which is also part of his talk today. Another pioneering area of Christoph's work is linguistic landscape research, notably the development of a digital application, Linkscape, for the documentation and annotation of signs from the linguistic landscape. And if I got it right, both the linguistic landscape of Luxembourg and digital discourse in the digital publics will play a role in his talk today. So thank you so much for being with us, Christoph, today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. And yes, you're right about everything. All the things you mentioned will be part of my presentation. Let me just bring up the slides that hopefully you can see. This is what I've prepared for you. I want to take a close look at the public debate on multilingualism in Luxembourg using a couple of different methods and data sets that I have gathered and developed during my 9.5 years in Luxembourg. So let's get started right away. Otherwise, I start making bad jokes and that helps no one. So here's a little overview of what I'm planning to talk about. First, maybe a quick conceptual discussion of why a multi-method approach to discourse analysis can be helpful. I will then focus on my case study, which is Luxembourg, and the current or recent debate on multilingualism, and specifically the role of Luxembourgish in this regard. And I will do so in taking different analytical steps, one after the other, introducing a couple of the methods and data sets that I've been working with. So let's get started right away. What is my current multi-method approach to discourse analysis? The idea behind it is to do something and maybe expand something that has been developed in mixed methods approaches. So combining different methodological ways of analyzing data, collecting data, and also presenting data that zoom in on the same topic. In this case, the Luxembourg debate on multilingualism. The idea is also, from a methodological point of view, to expand a bit this notion of mixed methods that often seems to be limited to qualitative plus quantitative binaries. Even in computational sociolinguistics, we mostly stick to one sort of augmented by the other. That is not me being critical about other people's approaches, including my own. That's just stating the fact that I want to try to combine as many approaches as possible or available to me to see what it brings about. This kind of approach to a specific society and its discourses, I think, requires a lot of background knowledge, in-depth knowledge of the sociocultural setting of a society, a language regime that you're zooming into, and also, of course, of the specific discourse in question. This is meant to contextualize the different findings that you have against the backdrop of a larger societal dynamics and situation. So you can only do this reliably, I think, if you already know what and where you're looking for. And I think Luxembourgish, that is sort of compact in both in size and also in terms of how discourse is organized, I think offers a very good test bed for doing this and testing such an approach, because we often have the feeling that we can see the entirety of discourse and see who is doing what and with what consequences. So it's sort of a societal laboratory that we try to harness for different purposes. Why should one do something like this, or should I do something like this? Well, there's two answers to this. The short answer would be because I can, meaning that I have, over the last 9 years, gathered a lot of different data sets together with my colleagues. And now I'm in the situation where I can just sort of pick the cherries from the different data sets and see how I can combine them into a comprehensive picture of what discourse on multilingualism has looked like over the last 9 years in Luxembourg. And I think if we try to do this, maybe we come to a point where we can learn more, or a multi-angled view of what has been going on in this discourse. But we will see how this turns out after or at the end of this presentation. In any case, I think trying to use many different data sets and methods and viewpoints on a specific discourse might reflect also how language is organized in real life practice, which is complex in different domains for different purposes by different actors. So I'm just trying to replicate and reflect a bit on what's going on in the life world anyways. But you can tell me after if that works out or not. In any case, my impression is that the recent Luxembourg debate requires such a multi-angled study because it has a couple of peculiarities that I want to zoom into that can be understood better if we see how certain patterns that I find in one data set reappear in another one and can help to explain what is going on from different points of view. Maybe before we start, a quick example of how this has been done in the past, in this case by myself. This does not mean that I only read papers that I wrote myself. It just means that I can explain this one better. Throughout the presentation, I will give you reference papers for the data sets and methods that I present, so that you can, if you want to, look them up somewhere. All the papers are available on the university repository and can be requested there from me directly, also as off-print. So a couple of years ago, I studied, sort of linking back to my prior position in Germany still, different varieties of German in Austria. And I say this in a neutral way because I know this term German in Austria is also the goal of ideological debates in academia, especially in Austria. So I'm agnostic when it comes to this. I just wanted to know how different varieties that we can find of the concept that people normally call German when speaking and writing, how they are perceived and evaluated in Austria. So I did a couple of different things. I had an attitude study that looked into how people perceive and evaluate the different varieties I was interested in. I also did linguistic landscape examination of the data we had collected in Linkscape before. And I also did an analysis of digital writing practices gathered from the Yodel application together with my friend DiLCo. And what we wanted to know, or what I wanted to know in this specific study was to find evidence of how the different varieties in question were recognized by different groups of people. So do they have certain social recognition, and what are the factors on which this depends? How is public visibility and the functions different varieties have in a discourse in a public sphere organized in Austria, in this case in Vienna? And also how do people make use of different written varieties to perform positioning acts in digital writing? And I call this, for theoretical reasons that I will not expand on, acts of self-assertion in practice. Right? So if you're interested in this, there's a paper on that. But let's move on to my current case study that might be even more interesting. But I say this while being in Luxembourg, so I might be a bit biased on that. As I said, my topic for today is the public debate on multilingualism. And I plan to give you 5 different pieces of analysis in this context. The first one will be what you could call a classic manual corpus analysis of text that I've gathered since my arrival in Luxembourg. The second one will be a computational modeling of user comments gathered from RTL.lu, the largest news outlet in the country that is entirely in Luxembourgish. The third step will be a perceptual mapping study where we used blank canvas tasks to let people draw their impressions of multilingualism in the country. And then I move on to our participatory research project that we've been running at the Institute for Luxembourgish since 2016. The first one being the attitude survey from the Schnissen project, and the second one being a quick look at the linguistic landscape as represented in the Linkscape project. And if we're lucky, the time has not run out by the end of this plan. We'll see. So maybe to give you a bit of background on how the Luxembourg debate has been looking since 2015, I give you a quick walk around through this history, this very recent history of ideological debates in Luxembourg. It has been argued that it all started in 2015, not because I arrived in Luxembourg in 2015, but there was a national referendum on voting rights for foreign residents at the national level for foreigners to participate in national elections. Why might that be a good thing? We are currently around 50% foreign resident population in the country, which means there's certain questions about the democratic legitimation of the political system when it comes to participation and this and that. For that reason, the then government decided to have this national referendum to see if foreign residents could participate under certain conditions in national elections. The political landscape, also here represented in the linguistic landscape, had the center and left-leaning parties largely in favor of this, as you can see here at the left with the Social Democrats, and the second position to the left is the Liberal Party, who on this question, and there were 2 other related questions, advocate for a yes. And then we have the sort of the center-right leaning parties, the one in orange here in the center, which are the Conservative Party, who did not want to make too publicly known that they were against it. So they just say, well, watch out. If you make your cross somewhere, that might have consequences. And then we have next to them in blue and white, the right-wing populist party, who openly and very visibly advocates for a no. So we had a political landscape that was sort of organized along political party ideologies, although the vast majority of the political landscape seemed to be in favor of this. The outcome of this was still 80% voting against this, which is very easily explained, I think, by the simple psychological fact that if you ask someone to give up on their privileges without any visible reimbursement for that, why would you? Right? So the majority of voters who already were able to vote voted against. So there was that. in a political sense. In a language ideological sense, however, this sparked a lot of consequences and follow-ups. For example, in 2016, where two public petitions that can be submitted with the government in Luxembourg by anyone living in the country had to be debated in parliament because they reached the threshold of necessary signatures for this, which is 4,500. And those two got a lot of public recognition and also were discussed a lot in the media. The first one here, we see people involved in this petition was the petition 698, initiated by Lucien Welter. And that one had the idea of establishing Luxembourgish as the first official and administrative language in the country, which it is currently not, because French and German are the primary administrative languages, and Luxembourgish is considered the national language. As analysis has shown, this petition was largely supported by people that come more from the rural areas of Luxembourg, which is the vast majority of the country, especially in the north. If you look at their argument, you would say that this has sort of a national conservative motivation that argues a lot with cultural identity and how language is important for maintaining this cultural identity. And they wanted, for this reason, to put Luxembourgish front center of the entire thing. As a direct reaction to this petition, there was a second one initiated by these two guys, Josef Schlasser and Henri Werner, who are part of the urban bourgeoisie, as you would call it. One of them is family with the former Prime Minister of Luxembourg, Pierre Werner. So this is really sort of the city crowd that has been living there for quite some time. Opposite to the other petition, those guys were arguing for preserving the multilingual status quo, and they do so from a motive that I would call cultural conservative, mainly arguing with the practical requirements of a multilingual society that has a complex demographic and a lot of foreign resident workers and population, for example. And those two, as I said, reached the threshold for discussion and had to be discussed in parallel in Parliament. You can still watch the video of this debate and also of the follow-up in Parliament, which is very instructive if you understand Luxembourgish. One of the outcomes of this discussion was in 2017 a promotion strategy for the Luxembourgish language that had to be discussed in Parliament again, developed by the Ministry of Education. You see Minister of Education Claude Maisch here, and also his then State Secretary Guy Arendt, who's not in place anymore, when they announced the promotion strategy for the Luxembourgish language. This had a huge effect also in the public sphere, because it was a very large development plan that has not 20 but 40 points, but it is developed for 20 years. That was my intention to put in the first bullet point. Sorry for that. I will tell you a bit more about this in a sec. One of the outcomes of this development plan was that we saw the introduction of a dedicated law for the promotion of Luxembourgish in 2018. We also got new institutions, which is a administrative commissioner for the Luxembourgish language and a specialized center for the Luxembourgish language, which is not the institute that I'm currently the head of, but is a state-run center that takes care of dictionary work, but also standardization and language promotion. We also have a bit more sort of measures that are a bit more on the weird side. For example, you can now win a folklore award for services to the Luxembourgish language if, for example, you're a language activist or have been trying to promote Luxembourgish for a couple of decades. You might sort of qualify for this award. Other things that we saw is that the government and the Center for the Luxembourgish Language have tried ever since this development plan to to inform the population, the broader population, of the official spelling rules of Luxembourgish. So Luxembourgish has an established orthography, but this is not being taught in schools, which leads to a situation where most of the people write Luxembourgish, but they don't know exactly how to. And this was the website for this campaign. It was also advertised in the linguistic landscape at bus stops with posters explaining certain rule sets in Luxembourgish. And there were also videos, and I will show you an example of this, explaining one specific rule of Luxembourgish orthography.
Ich sehe großen Hexenmeister, verwanne Hokus Pokus on.
Regel 8. Man vun eng Wut gët den N oder Dubelen geschriwen, wann et Wut an Dr mat eng Vokal oder mat N, D, T, Z oder H ufängt. Sos gewéinlech net. Weest wéi? Schreiwen.lu. Eng Kampagne vum Edukationsministère.
Right. So this was one of the measures taken to popularize the spelling norm in the population, in this case explaining a phonological context rule that makes it necessary to delete a singular or a double N at the end of a word, which is also the main source of error in writing Luxembourgish for most people who do it. Another outcome of this discourse was that we saw a politicization of the topic before the national elections in 2018, where in particular one language activist group on Facebook organized a lot of public buzz and media buzz around what they saw as important topics, one of them being the role of the Luxembourgish language. In this case, we get informed that without any doubt, the first kings of France must have spoken Luxembourgish. I leave you with a historical interpretation of this claim, but they had other topics related to this, the demographic development of the country and the economic state of the country as well. And there was all mixed up in this populist idea of how to be against the referendum for voting rights for foreign residents. This is where this group started. This is also where the name Nee 2015 comes from, so it's no in 2015. But I wanted also to change this and have a bit of a perspective for the future. This is why they added the way to 2050 afterwards. But we also, so this kind of language activism was picked up in the media. So here we see a television discussion of political parties and also the main actor in this language activist group discussing how much Luxembourgish our land needs, our country needs, right? And there was articles over articles in the press. There were Facebook comments. There were other social media discussions. So there was a lot of discussion for this small country and this small language. One of the interesting developments is that the main figures behind this language activist group at some point officially joined the right-wing political party and are by now some of the members of the national parliament in the country, sort of so the party was trying to incorporate this topic as part of their political agenda, relatively successfully, I would say, by now. But we also saw this in the election campaigns of other political parties, in this case, the Liberal Party, who at this time and still has the Ministry of Education being in charge of this development plan. And they propose here as part of their main slogan in the election campaign, a future in Luxembourgish or a Luxembourgish version of the future that is sort of semantically double-coded in Luxembourgish, which is not the worst slogan to have, but still it plays with this idea of language identity in the country somehow. So this was a huge topic in this election campaign. After the election, this sort of flattened out, and we saw mostly a consolidation of the new structures established in this discourse, which, for example, is an expansion of the language learning opportunities, not necessarily in school curricula, but for Luxembourgish as a second language. We see a lot of dictionary and vocabulary work in the Center for Luxembourgish Language, also an ongoing standardization of the language. We see also, mainly by the right-wing populist party, a political appropriation of the topic. And in general, this discussion sort of has vanished from the public sphere mostly. There's not too much to discuss anymore. So with that background, let's finally delve into some data and see what comes about when we look into what I call discourse figures. Maybe starting with the very question, what actually are the figures in discourse? I will give you a quick example here. Those two things I consider discourse figures. We have here a citation by the Minister of Education, Claude Maisch again. And when I talk about discourse figures, I normally refer to like these kinds of statements, typical formulations or linguistic images that have sort of central functions in discourse. I would also say sometimes they have structure forming functions in discourse. They can be used as topoi, they can be used, they will be picked up by media and other actors and sort of structure the entire discussion around this. And the second part is, of course, that statements like this do not hang in the open air, but they are made by people, by social or political actors with certain functions, and who have, by their position, certain powers to bring structure to this discourse. If, for example, I was the Minister of Education, I could introduce a development law for the Luxembourgish language, as has happened in this case, right? So these two, keep in mind that I sometimes also refer to both of them when I talk about discourse figures. Just a quick maybe background analysis of what I normally do when I look at statements like this, asking sort of some basic question to contextualize these statements. The first would be, who is the actor that actually makes such a statement? In this case, it's a powerful actor, the Minister of Education, who has a central position in discourse and also practical position that can change things by legislation, for example. What's the reason for this? This is a statement that came up during the election campaign. And what he's trying to do, I think, is sort of at the same time addressing people who are in favor of promoting multilingualism as a practical necessity, and people who are advocating for a stronger representation for Luxembourgish. And he's addressing both in one statement, which is sort of a smart thing to do. And he is announcing sort of a further development of the language regime while doing so. But many of these statements, I think, do not have only one semantic layer of coding, but two. So, and this is nothing that I would say is intentional even in many cases, but you can always read these statements on various layers. And I would at least assume two in this case, which might be the intended one in the statement, sort of giving both sides of discourse, people who are sort of advocating and discussing the practical needs in a multilingual society, something to work with, and also those who wish for a stronger cultural representation of Luxembourg, right? So this sort of talking to both at the same time and in one sentence. At the same time, I think on an implicit level, he's sort of making a theoretical or unnecessary distinction between Luxembourgish on the one pole of this discourse and multilingualism on the other, that he does for strategic reasons, of course, because he wants to address them both individually. But with that, he's sort of singling out Luxembourgish in the context of multilingualism, which is, from a linguistic point of view, a bit weird, because Luxembourgish without multilingualism wouldn't work. And this is the way I'm analyzing these kinds of data, and I want to replicate this for a couple of more statements in the first study that I want to discuss, which is my manual corpus analysis. So for this purpose, ever since coming to Luxembourg, I have collected articles, public statements, videos, social media discussions on multilingualism and the role of Luxembourgish in discourse. So everything that I can get my hands on lands in a large box, and at some point I will look at it and do something with it. For this study specifically, I have a data set of roughly 700 texts from all different kinds of sources, which are public and private media, articles, data from social networks, book publications, political communications, videos, everything basically that I could find. What did I do with this? I tried to catalog this, annotate this according to my research interests, and search specifically for these kinds of discourse figures. So A, actors, central actors and figures in discourse, and B, their central statements that have been picked up then by other actors and media outlets, for example, to have this kind of central role in discourse. If you're looking for a paper about this, there's one here at the bottom of the slide. So what can you do with this kind of corpus? The first thing would be looking at a couple of examples. And this one would be one of the most notorious ones that you can often say, stating something like, no, this is not a Luxembourgish word. In Luxembourgish, we say, normally you would find such statements from language activists and folklorists, so people who feel in charge of preserving the Luxembourgish language making sure that not too many foreign words sort of are represented and become part of Luxembourgish. But you can also see, as we will see in a second, politicians say something like this. Why would you talk about this topic in such a way? Luxembourgish is a very plastic language that has many loan words and structures from French, from German, and from other languages as well, and has a lot of ongoing variation and change in both in spoken and written. So there's a lot of things going on, and they have been going on historically because Luxembourgish developed in close contact with German and French as sort of a variety of German, and now has been officialized for quite some time into an official language. So the purpose of these statements often is to signal that one is willing to keep Luxembourgish pure, to preserve its authentic quality, to its characteristics that get lost when too many loan words and structures come in. And we, of course, know this kind of ideological statement from many different contexts. Just think about gender inclusive language and how these discussions work in different countries. This might be the same kind of discussion in a way. But let's see one very specific instance of this discourse. For those of you who understand German, you will likely be able to understand what this politician says here. This is from the parliament session where the development plan for the Luxembourgish language and the upcoming law were discussed. And this here is a member of the Liberal Party, so the party that felt in charge of promoting Luxembourgish. Let's see what he has to offer.
Und da könnte auch die schreckliche Verdeutschung dabei. Hai pur Beispiele, die auch mal an der geschwarter Presse heiert. Sie sind an den Zug gestiegen. Lützeburgisch kennt das Wort überhaupt nicht. Wir sagen, dass wir an den Zug klammen oder geklommen sind oder dass wir aus dem Zug oder Bus rausklammen. Ein anderes Beispiel, der Gerd an Heim veranstaltet ein Ball. Im Himmels Willen, ein Ball wird nicht veranstaltet, mehr organisiert.
Yeah, we can clearly tell that he seems to be agitated about the fact that there's too many German words floating into the Luxembourgish language, making it impossible to speak proper Luxembourgish. Right? And he discusses two examples here, and he calls this awful Germanization also. Right? This was part of a couple of different party speeches here in this session, and all of them are interesting in many different regards, but this one had the strongest focus on language preservation. And it's interesting also to look at the guy in the back, the then president of the parliament in Luxembourg, who has a hard time not making too many faces while listening to all these speeches. So going back to this example, on a surface layer of ideology, I would say this kind of statement is used to highlight and maybe protect traditional Luxembourgish words, to keep Luxembourgish as a language intact. We also hear a lot of claims about authenticity, being down to earth while using traditional words. So all these arguments that go into the direction that you can sort of have this kind of authentic language use while preserving this kind of historical set of words that by accident are the basis for your own language that you learned when you were a child. Well, often, so there's a mix between language ideological and biographical preferences that we see in these arguments. Implicitly, however, you're sort of contributing to an ideology that treats incoming words, especially German ones in this case, as a threat to Luxembourgish because it becomes more foreign. Many of the traditions, the cultural foundations of Luxembourgish, of Luxembourg as a nature gets lost, and everything is in decay apparently. Right? So there's a huge nexus of ideological stances that we could look into using just this example. But let's take a second one to move on in our data here. This would also be something that in many different variations can be found in basically all different contexts you can think of. Luxembourg's official language, French, German, and our language. You can hear this by everyone. You can find it in every text. This is one specific way in which Luxembourgers, speakers of Luxembourg, who grew up here in the country, will refer to Luxembourgish as our language. We also know this from other language ideological debates, for example, in Catalonia. But in Luxembourg, this has been around for quite some time. It might also be linked to the nation building process that took a while and was also politically complicated. So this has been a way for Luxembourgers addressing Luxembourgish not by its technical name, Luxembourgish, but by naming it our language, right? And what you do here, of course, is you establish a close link between your own identity, Luxembourgish as a language, and the nation that you claim to be part of. And this has, of course, the purpose then to emphasize the special role that Luxembourgish has as a means of integration, as a means of building this national cultural identity that Luxembourg apparently has and needs, right? And the role of the other languages is then apparently different because they are not claimed to be our language. Looking at the different layers of semantic coding again, of course, on the surface layer, you're showing a positive identification with this language, claiming this as being yours, right? Sort of, this is part of my heritage, part of my country, part of my culture. But at the same time, of course, implicitly, you're providing sort of preconditions for social belonging via language, because if Luxembourgish is our language, it might not be your language, right? While you're still living in the country. So there is also a way, I think, implicitly to claim who might belong to Luxembourg. And often if you ask people about who belongs to the country, they would say that speaking the language is the most important means of integration to sort of be considered part of this country. Let's move on and use this one here as a bridge, which is one of the most notorious formulations that you can find. It's also a topos, I would say. People in Luxembourg have spent a lot of time discussing situations like going to the bakery, shopping for bread and pastry. And what people will often refer to, especially people who speak Luxembourgish, is that they don't like the fact that people will not speak Luxembourgish in the bakeries, but instead ask them to switch to French by asking them en français, s'il vous plaît. Right? And this really has become this kind of shibboleth formulation that people use to complain about the fact that other people in their eyes are not willing to integrate linguistically. Right? That these people, on the other hand, are doing the jobs that the Luxembourgers don't want to do is a different story, but we have a clear expectation of what is needed to be a legitimate member of society and what is needed to work in this environment. Right? On a practical level, what can go wrong if you need to order bread in French, even if you don't know it, you just point to what you want, as the person on the right does, and put some money on the counter and you're good, right? But there's other contexts where this role of language is more important, maybe. I will come back to this later. Let's go for a second to the second study that I have for you. And sort of the coming studies will be a bit quicker, so we will maintain our time limit, I think. For this computational study, I took 600,000, as it says here on the slide, user comments from rtl.lu, which is a journal, sort of a news outlet that also has a comment function underneath the articles. And we put all the user comments that we had into a word embedding model, which is a computational approach to looking for hidden structures in large data sets. And the reference paper you find at the bottom again. The method that I'm using here is that I look into the vector representations of words in this model, and I read them as indications of discursive closeness, sort of to see how close different concepts are in my data. Right? What this basically does, only to give you a visual impression, is that it takes all the data on the left in raw form, and it sort of the model that you train computes, and at the end it will have a certain structure with words organized according to some contextual similarity. And this kind of contextual similarity you can do queries with to see what are the words this model considers to be the most closely related. What this contextual similarity means is a bit difficult to say. I just give you 3 slightly political examples here. One would be similarity through context, having the first 2 sentences here, the SUV parks on the sidewalk, the dirt slinger parks on the sidewalk, where these 2 words given here in orange are related through their context. So they appear in similar contexts, so they might appear more similar to the model. If something can appear to a model, that's a different question, not for today. The second criterion might be similarity through meaning. In the second set of examples, the worker cannot afford the flat, the civil servant can afford the villa, where these 2 sort of are part of this semantic word field of housing opportunities, if you can afford them. And the last example here would be sort of word class as an indication of similarity for the two adjectives given at the bottom. So what can you do with data like this? For example, you can simply claim what I do here, that groups of contextually similar words show which topics are discussed together in the discourse and which are not. And I want to give you two brief examples. The first one being our language. So the combination of Eis and Spruch. If I use this as a query to my model, I get, in this case, the 10 most closely related concepts here that you have given in orange with translations at the end of the line. And as you can see, we get a mix of very interesting concepts here. We have, for example, in the second and in the fourth position, writing variants or misspellings partly of the term or the concept language. We have a regional variant of our here at the sixth position, but we have references to French and German, but not to the concept of Luxembourgish, interestingly. And the rest of the concepts that you see here are those related to things like social integration, the role of Luxembourgish as the national language, identity, tradition. So there seems to be something going on when people mention our language in this data. If you would do sort of the cross-testing using Luxembourgish as a query term, you would only get language labels. No other interesting concepts here. So there is something that is specific to this combination of Eis and Spruch. Let's move over to the second, to what I call the topos of the bakery here, asking for the connection, the most similar terms to language and bakery or baker, Spruch and Bäcker. And using these 10 concepts here, you could really retell the story that people tell in comments when they complain about this, right? They want to use their language when they buy a croissant in the bakery, which is their mother tongue Luxembourgish, but they can't because the saleswoman only speaks French, which is a foreign language. And this is the same with the butcher and the carpentry. Generally, buying pastry is a drag in Luxembourgish in French, right? So this is sort of the narrative behind this. And this, of course, could be due to the fact that there is only very limited evidence of this in the data set, but it's not. If you look at these concepts and these comments manually, you will find numerous instances where people do discussions like these, again in Luxembourgish here, but this is basically two people discussing this, the first one being in favor of multilingualism, basically saying, well, why shouldn't I order pastry by their French names? In Luxembourg, you need multiple language to get through your day. And the second one replying, yeah, but I also feel weird if I have to order stuff that has Luxembourgish names in French. This is also a matter of respect, and people are arrogant if they don't sort of make the effort of learning at least a bit of Luxembourgish to cater to my needs. Right? So, and there's plenty of these comments in the data. So there's evidence really for what happens here. There's additional evidence from perception studies that we did. In this case, asking people for the individual experience with multilingualism in the country. So far, what we've looked at in the data is mostly the perspective of people who consider themselves part of Luxembourgish society. That happens largely in Luxembourgish, right? And what is missing so far is the inside-in perspective, as I would call it. So having foreign residents who are maybe by the language barrier not active participants in this Luxembourgish part of society and public discourse, but are still residents in the country and hence part of the country and part of society. So in order to collect data from them, we did a blank canvas drawing task, asking them how do we experience multilingualism in Luxembourg, and asking them to draw whatever they wanted to illustrate this. We had 28 pairs of people. Both of them were first doing an individual drawing, and after they had to do one collective drawing, also discussing the individual strategies, and they had to come up with a collective strategy for what remains in their drawing and what. So this is also interesting from a drawing point of view. So what remains, what are the semiotic strategies that people use to signal what their experiences are. It also shows you who can draw and who can't, but that's a different story. There's also a paper about this that sort of talks about this in the larger context of perceptual mapping experiments and sociolinguistics, if you're interested. But let's look at a couple of examples quickly. The first one, of course, takes us back to the bakery that one of the participants made a drawing of, replicating exactly the situation that I explained before, where the person here on the left that doesn't look very happy asked for 3 bread rolls in Luxembourgish, and you have a happy bakery salesperson here, so happy that's even standing on the counter in between the bakery products, asking en français s'il vous plaît, could you please rephrase this in French? Right? And in the interview after, the person also said that this would be a situation that they would encounter often in the media, and some Luxembourgers would complain about this, but it had no practical implications in real life. So this apparently is a thing, right? I might have discovered these topics in the different data sets. A second one, where this role of language capabilities is actually more important, is here seen in an extract from a larger scene, being at the hospital while being sick. We have a patient here on the left and the doctor on the right, and the doctor asks in French sort of what has happened, where do you have pain? So what's your problem? And as you can see on the left, the patient is also not happy again, signals by pointing, this is the arrow here that we see on the left, pointing to his hand or their hand and indicating simply saying our, right? There's some problem. And also in the thought bubble, you can see that they're signaling misunderstanding. They don't understand the French. And this would be a second topos that we find in many discussions around multilingualism. Compared to the bakery situation, this might be a bit more loaded with practical consequences, but because if you go to the doctor and you're not able to explain where you have your pain, you might not get the appropriate treatment, right? You might feel in a situation where you're not getting what you need to feel better. Let's move on to maybe my favorite example, which is here, one of the many negotiations that we have in everyday life about which language to speak next, because you cannot predict this easily in Luxembourgish. You never know what competencies, what repertoire the person has you encounter if you don't know them already. We see here 2 phases of a negotiation. The first one, where people settle on a language, first indicating Luxembourgish might be an option. Then the second one says, well, I speak English, and then they settle on French, right? They share this speech bubble at the bottom of the first image. And in the second phase, we get a complete attitudinal evaluation of this choice, because the first person on the left then starts speaking French. And the second person here, A, is apparently either not willing or able to speak French. We see that their mouth is crossed through. In the thought bubble, we also see that they seem to dislike French somehow. They seem to evaluate this badly. And as a consequence of this, we also see that their brain apparently is shrinking, as we see on the right in the silhouette of the skull here, right? So there's a complex evaluation going on here. So this is why I love this. Image is also very nicely drawn, and it tells us a lot about what's going on in multilingualism. Let's very quickly take a look at the 2 remaining data sets. The first one being an attitude survey that we did as part of the Schnissen citizen science app that is collecting spoken Luxembourgish in the country. We have 1,832 crowdsourced questionnaires from our mobile app, speakers of Luxembourgish mostly, and we asked them different kinds of questions about their individual norm horizons, their practical language preferences, and attitudes towards multilingualism, and the reference paper is the same as for the second study in this case. Just showing you a couple of question context here, asking about the state of multilingualism in general, and often we use these 3-step questions, asking about the current state, the future state, and the desired state of a question or of a topic. Excuse me. In this case, you can see that the majority of people seems to think that multilingualism is working sort of without problems and will also remain so in the future, but they seem to agree that in any case, Luxembourg should remain a multilingual country. The second question is the question of whether or not Luxembourgish is actually an independent language, which is by law, of course, but still you would find Luxembourgers arguing against this, saying that it's simply or merely a dialect of German. But as you see, if we ask this, the vast majority of people agrees that Luxembourgish actually is an independent language. They also think it should be recognized as language of the European Union, which it is not by now. But they also think, a vast majority of them thinks that newcomers should learn Luxembourgish as a means of integration. So we see people have a very established horizon of expectation when it comes to what this language should be and how it should work in practice. This is backed up by another question here for the most important languages in the country, Luxembourgish, French, German, English, and Portuguese. When we ask people which of these languages belong to the country, as you can see here on the left, Luxembourgish is considered to be part of the country by almost everybody. With French and German, this is already getting a bit more complicated because the majority says yes, it belongs to the country, but we're not as convinced as for Luxembourgish, right? Having this distance again between our language and the other two. And what becomes clear is that English and Portuguese are considered to be less actively part of the country. So we have a very nice hierarchy of recognition for the different languages. And the last question asking which of these languages should be more visible in public space. People would agree that Luxembourgish needs more visibility, sort of backing this claim of the wish for cultural representation through Luxembourgish, and all the other languages basically should not be more visible in public space, with the difference between German and English, where people mostly don't care, and French and Portuguese, where people would claim a bit more that they don't want them to be more present, especially Portuguese, which of course, to a larger part of the population is not accessible. And this brings us to my last point, already a very, very quick look at the linguistic landscape, taking data that we have for the Luxembourgish linguistic landscape from our linguistic landscaping platform, Linkscape. And we just looked for evidence of these discourse figures in the data that we have, which are more than 3,000 photos right now. And there's another reference paper for you if you're interested. We find relatively little evidence in the linguistic landscape of the entire discourse that I'm researching. We have one instance here that is a sticker by this language activist group campaigning against the voting right for foreign residents that was still there in 2019. So it's quite resilient, as is the group, sadly. So, but this is one of the few instances that we could actually find. There's other ones, for example, you see here on the left, sort of the opposite position without any claim of authorship. We don't know who that is. But what is interesting is the one on the right. This is an advertisement for the German hardware store Hornbach, who here claims, well, look, we have a store in Luxembourg, and they give the location of the store in 3 different languages, in Luxembourgish, French, and German, then claiming that they're catering, that they're sort of to all of them, which is a direct reflection of this discussion, having this very inclusive, of course, from an economic point of view, necessary stance towards this discussion to multilingualism. But these are the only instances that we find, which reminds us that many of the potentially interesting instances we missed because people did not make photos of them. For example, political campaigning, from on the left here, the Liberal Party, again, advertising this, the future in Luxembourgish. And this one here bringing us back to the first petition that we saw, because the initiator of the petition joined at some point this right-wing political party, saying here that only Eichspruch, only our language, should be used for integration in school. Right? So this also tells you that the data we get through crowdsourcing might be interesting, but it might not be the data we need for analyzing a discourse properly. Which brings me to my conclusion. I would make 3 points here after all the stuff that I discussed. This kind of multi-method approach that I have developed and that I love using whatever I do, apparently, can provide a multifaceted insight into a discourse if you combine the right methods, if you have this background knowledge that you need. The Luxembourg debate on multilingualism, I think, is particularly interesting in this regards because, as I said, it's small. We have a limited number of ideologies in place and actors that enable us to really see what's going on the scenes and behind the scenes. And I also think and would make the claim that this concept of discourse figures seems to catch some kind of pertinent aspect in the discourse. For example, when it comes to which topoi and which kinds of figures have this kind of structure forming effects in practice. And with that, I will say Eddie, au revoir, auf Wiedersehen, goodbye from the University of Luxembourg, and will still remain in the room, of course, in case you have any questions. Thank you for bearing with me. And I stop my screen share, I think. Voila.
Thank you so much, Christoph, for this very rich and enticing talk. Also a longish talk. We have a few minutes for discussion, and I would now invite the audience to either give me a sign and then speak up with your question, and you feel free to open up the cam as well if you wish, or paste your question into the chat, and then Zhenya Yuditska will read it out so that we can all engage with it. I see a sign by Tanisha and Caroline. Can I take your switching on the camera as a sign of, no, not yet. Tanisha Pandey.
Hi, Christoph. It's so nice to see you. It took me back to the pandemic classes with you.
Hi, Tanisha.
I was wondering if you could talk to me about topos, because that term came up in across all of your methodologies.
Mm-hmm.
Wondering how you use the term, because you also use the term shibboleths. I'm asking because I also understood the sentiment behind the bakery story, but I wouldn't know for myself what a topos would look like for my analysis.
Yeah, so this is why I said, so this kind of rich background knowledge may need to be in place in order to understand what is the difference between a simple statement and a reference to a topos. So the reason why I like to call these situations, the bakery and also the clinic, topoi, is that they are only partly grounded in everyday experience. So in practice, the situation of going to the bakery and not being able to buy stuff in Luxembourgish might happen, but it does not have necessarily consequences. And it seems to be mostly present in discourse, not necessarily seen in real life. So people will not go into the bakery and confront people about not speaking Luxembourgish, or only rarely they would do so. But they will complain about it after in the comment section of this newspaper media platform. So this is something that mostly happens in discourse. And this is why I also use the term topos for those. With the clinic or the medical care, it's a bit different because this happens a lot. That you, in a multilingual country, you go to the doctor's office and you sort of have to choose a doctor, and they only speak, I don't know, French, Greek, and Russian, but you don't have access to any of those languages. So what do you do in order to describe where your problem is and to get the adequate treatment for this? Right? This is something that has real life consequences. This is also in elderly care. This is important. So everybody goes to the nursing homes, but not the entire personnel speaks the necessary languages, maybe. So there's also claims for language training. So this might be on the brink of being a real life problem, not only a topos, but it has a similar function in this discourse that I'm looking at. It has its own life in the discourse that is not necessarily always linked to the basis in practice.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Zhenya, this one for you, I think.
So there's a question in the chat from Olga Kellert who says, hello, Christoph, how do you find the pictures for the linguistic landscapes?
Hi, Olga. So we use our Linkscape platform. That is our citizen science linguistic landscaping tool that we have. And I basically took all the photos in our database, which by now are closing in 100,000 images. That are labeled as being in Luxembourg. So I just took a subset of the data that we have, and then I went through them manually to look for interesting evidence.
And then she says, thank you. And then there's another question saying, thank you for the very interesting and multifaceted talk and this critical look at multilingualism. Can I ask about the difference between English and German versus French, Portuguese perception in public space, and why you think this may be?
Okay, yeah, I think this is one of the central points of this entire discussion, that in larger parts of the Luxembourgish situation, population, people might seem to grow weary of the role that French has in the country. And this has different, is I think related to different factors, one of them being that French is a present and very important language in the country, but not everybody has equal access to it. It is also a proxy in a way. People will not openly complain about too many foreigners in the country, because that would be weird in a country that completely relies on foreign workforce. But people will complain about languages being too present in the public sphere, instead of, for example, there's too much French in the public instead of there's too many French-speaking people in the country. Right? So people use this as a proxy. and this is, with Portuguese, we have around 18% people of the population in the country that claims Portuguese roots, which is a lot. And Portuguese is also a very present language in the country. If you go on public transport, for example, you will hear a lot of Portuguese, very little Luxembourgish, because Luxembourgers go by car. But Portuguese is always discussed as a language of migration. Even in the third or fourth generation, you will always be linked to this idea of being a migrant somehow. Also, of course, the larger Luxembourgish population has limited access to Portuguese. So there's emotions about that. With German and English, German people don't care about much because A, it does not have many domains in practice left. It's the language of the primary language of alphabetization in schools still. And it's the main language of the news, the printed media and also the online media. But these are coming under pressure because Luxembourgish is on the rise currently. And English is unproblematic because it has a very good image right now, especially in the younger generation. It has a very high prestige. Our students will always prefer English to French and German as their secondary language. So this leads to a very interesting setup in hierarchizing the languages in the language regime right now.
Given the time, we can take another comment. The one last one.
Yes. So the last comment from Imana Bufaden is, how would you describe the status of Luxembourgish as a bottom-up developed or top-down kind of linguistic policy? And also, they say, thanks for this amazing talk. It is relatable to many linguistic landscapes around the world, and Algeria is a good example of this.
Oh, cool. Thank you. I will look into that. So Luxembourgish, I think, is both. On the one hand, we see right now that the development of Luxembourgish is largely driven by top-down politics. So from the government introducing development plans, introducing a new version of the orthography, introducing new institutions, for example. So this is clearly top-down development, right? But this is at the same time a reaction to this discourse where politicians saw the need or were in fear that there is some kind of need in the population that they weren't addressing. So it's always sort of a mix of both. Where we see bottom-up development in Luxembourgish is clearly in the written domain, because for the longest time, people at least since the advent of social media, people have been writing Luxembourgish in everyday life, in digital media and social media, but no one knows exactly how to. So people are coming up with their individual and synchronized through groups versions of writing Luxembourgish that are only in loose contact with the policy imposed from above, because they have no point of contact in school, for example, where they can sort of reformulate their knowledge of how to write Luxembourgish. And we also see in the population a new upcoming interest in writing Luxembourgish correctly and in correcting others. So there seems to be something developing, something that you could call an awareness for a linguistic norm that is developing in the population right now.
And on this note, and given the time, we will conclude and say thank you once again to Christoph for the talk. And meet us once again in 4 weeks from today, on the 23rd of May, for a talk by Dong Yuan from the University of Utrecht on computational social linguistics again. Thank you and have a good one. Bye-bye.